You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In October of 2004, a 15-year-old girl suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in a total panic. She didn't know where she was, and it was so dark in the room she couldn't see anything. And when she tried to move, she realized she couldn't. She was paralyzed. She tried to calm down and just listen for some sign of where she was or what was going on, but all she could hear were the unfamiliar sounds of machines beeping and whirring. Then the horror sunk in. She was locked inside of her own body, and she had no idea why. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button to an overnight paranormal investigation at an abandoned hospital, and after you get inside, tell them you need to use the bathroom, but just proceed to leave and lock all the doors. This week's story is called Silent Scream. On a Monday morning in October of 2004, 15-year-old Gina Giese rode the bus to school in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a suburb about an hour outside of Milwaukee. As the bus hit a pothole, she felt her stomach lurch. She'd had a stomachache all morning and barely touched the toast her mom handed her for breakfast. Normally, Gina would have taken any excuse to miss school on a Monday, but today was different. It was the start of homecoming week at St. Mary Springs High School, and she had been looking forward to it since the end of summer vacation. It was also her first year on the varsity volleyball team, which was a big deal for a sophomore. Gina didn't want to miss practice for the big game against their rival school, which was taking place that Thursday. As the bus pulled into the school parking lot, Gina convinced herself that she'd feel fine once she saw her friends and got to class. But the moment she stood up from her seat, she felt heavy and sluggish. It was like an invisible weight was trying to pull her through the floor. It took all her energy just to make it to English class. She spent the rest of the day fighting to keep her eyes open until it was finally time to go home. Later that night, while watching TV, Gina felt her arm start to tingle. She shook it, but the tingling wouldn't go away. Gina decided that she was probably just fighting off a flu bug, and so she just needed a good night's rest. And so she went to bed, and it didn't take long for her to fall into a deep sleep. But when she woke up the next morning, she didn't feel any better. In fact, as the week went by, Gina still just did not get any better. By Thursday, she was still exhausted and feeling achy. But today was the day of her big volleyball game, and Gina was not going to miss it. She dragged herself out of bed, but when she reached for her robe, her arm felt like it was made of lead. But she shook it off and took a deep breath, and then headed to the bathroom. A few hours later, Gina took her spot on the volleyball court. She felt a bit queasy, but she chalked it up to pregame nerves. The stands were full of supporters chanting and eager to cheer her team on. Once the game started, the opposing team served the ball over the net. One of Gina's teammates got underneath it, lobbing the ball towards Gina and setting her up for an easy play. All she had to do was spike it over the net. But as the ball got closer to her, her vision suddenly doubled. She was seeing two white volleyballs sailing toward her face. Gina blinked, unsure of which one to hit. She leaped up, swatting at the air, and her palm did make contact with the hard vinyl ball, and immediately a jolt of pain shot through her arm. But she didn't care, because she had done her job and returned the ball. The other team dove for it and missed. As the ball fell to the floor, the stands erupted. Gina had scored. She smiled and blinked a few times. A moment later, her double vision had cleared, and she breathed a sigh of relief. She was on a roll for the rest of the game. After the game, Gina went out with her teammates for some celebratory ice cream. By the time she got home, she had forgotten all about the double vision from the start of the game. Her arm was a little stiff from hitting so many balls, but she felt better. The next morning, Gina slept through her alarm and woke up late. She tried to get up, but her entire body was so achy and stiff. Her forehead was hot, but her teeth were chattering, and she was thirsty. She desperately needed a glass of water. Gina swung her legs over the side of the bed, then lurched forward to stand up, and nearly fell over sideways. It wasn't that her body felt limp. It was like her joints were so stiff she couldn't move them, so she couldn't walk. She felt like a mechanical doll whose battery had run out. Gina fell back into bed and called her dad, John, for help. John ran upstairs and came over to help his daughter out of bed. Gina threw her arm around his shoulder, and he propped Gina up onto her feet. Then John walked her down the hallway to the bathroom. Even though he tried to look calm, Gina could see the fear in her father's eyes. She tried to thank him for helping, but it was like talking with a mouthful of peanut butter. Her brain knew the words, but her tongue just couldn't keep up. That's when her dad yelled out to her mom, Anne, and said to get Gina's pediatrician on the phone right away. Anne got an appointment and helped John get Gina into her jacket, and then they guided her out to the car. Gina could barely put one foot in front of the other. But on the way to the doctor, something even more frightening happened to Gina. Her left arm just started jerking uncontrollably, and so her mom held Gina's other hand, looking totally panicked and afraid. Gina's mind was so foggy she could barely process what was going on. Less than an hour later, Gina was at her pediatrician's office. The doctor put her through blood tests, a CT imaging scan, and an MRI. Once those were all done, they sent her to an examination room to wait for the results. Gina shivered as she sat on the thin paper stretched out over the doctor's examination table. Her arms still shook uncontrollably, and her parched mouth was filled with saliva. She had been drinking water, but nothing could quench her thirst. Eventually, there was a knock at the door, and Gina's doctor walked into the room. He had a calm demeanor, but Gina could see in his eyes that something was clearly wrong. He told Gina and her parents that there was clearly something going on to make Gina extremely sick, but he just didn't know what it was yet. Gina's blood work came back fine. The neurologist couldn't find anything on her CT scans either. Gina didn't understand what this all meant, but she was scared. She could feel drool leaking out the side of her mouth, but she couldn't muster enough energy to make it stop. The doctor handed Anne a tissue, and Gina felt her mother's hand gently wipe it away. The doctor said that Gina needed to see a specialist at a larger hospital in Milwaukee, 70 miles away, and she had to get there fast. Minutes later, Gina was loaded into the back of an ambulance. Her parents held her hand and promised they'd follow right behind. During the ride to the hospital, Gina felt dizzy, so she leaned her head back against the stretcher she was strapped to and closed her eyes. She hoped that this next doctor would have an answer and she'd feel better soon. Despite the sound of the blaring siren, Gina could barely keep her eyes open, and she quickly fell asleep. The next thing that Gina remembered was waking up in a stark white hospital room with fluorescent ceiling lights that hurt her eyes. A nurse came in to check Gina's blood pressure. She asked if Gina could stand up. Gina slid off the hospital bed, and for a moment, she stood perfectly still. Then her body started jerking violently. The nurse caught her before she fell to the ground and helped her into a wheelchair. When Gina sat down, her eyesight became blurry again. It was like she was looking at the nurse through a sheet of wax paper. But even still, Gina could make out the nurse's sympathetic expression. The nurse told Gina not to worry. The neurologists would have her test results soon. Dr. Rodney Willoughby was in his office when Gina's test results arrived a few minutes later. He read and reread the results a dozen times. He was the lead doctor on Gina's case, and he needed to be absolutely certain of what he was seeing. He'd been a doctor for over 20 years, but this was his first time encountering a case like this. And now he was about to deliver the most tragic diagnosis of his career. With a heavy heart, he left his office and walked into the small room where Gina's parents were waiting. Anne and John both stood to greet him, looking hopeful. Dr. Willoughby sighed and broke the news. Gina had contracted a fast-moving, fatal disease that killed almost 60,000 people every year. And while there was a vaccine, Gina was now too far gone for it to work. No one in recorded history had ever survived once this disease progressed this far. Dr. Willoughby told Gina's parents that over the next 24 to 48 hours, Gina's organs would fail and her heart would stop. At this point, the only thing they could do was keep her comfortable until she died. Judging from Anne and John's blank expressions, Dr. Willoughby could see that his horrific words had not sunk in yet. Then Anne collapsed into her husband, sobbing. John begged Dr. Willoughby for a solution. There had to be something they could do. But Dr. Willoughby just shook his head. There was no beating this disease. He stood with Gina's parents while they grieved, then gave them privacy to sit with their daughter. By this point, Gina was drifting in and out of consciousness. Dr. Willoughby could tell she wasn't coherent enough to understand what was happening to her. It was heartbreaking to know there was nothing he could do to help her. But throughout the afternoon, Dr. Willoughby was finding it harder and harder to accept Gina's fate. He called the CDC before he left the office. He knew the chances were slim, but he wanted to know if there was any new or promising research that could save Gina's life. They said no. But Dr. Willoughby was not satisfied, so he decided to do some digging of his own. Later that night, he pored over a stack of medical studies and published research. For hours, he flipped through page after page of the same grim findings, drinking coffee to keep himself awake. Finally, sometime past midnight, an autopsy report caught his eye. Until that point, most of the medical community assumed that Gina's disease caused organ failure by eating away at the brain. But this report suggested that wasn't actually true. The pathogens left the brain completely intact. Instead, the virus kills by disrupting the brain's ability to regulate necessary body functions like respiration and heart rate. That's what causes the body to shut down and die, but not by damaging the brain itself. Dr. Willoughby was even more fascinated by what he read next. The autopsy showed that just before each of these victims died, their immune systems actually began to fight back. That meant that the disease was beatable. It just caused organ failure too quickly for the immune system to react. Dr. Willoughby wondered if there was a way to temporarily shut down Gina's brain activity without killing her. If this could be done, her brain would be protected from the deadly viral attack. The pathogens would be prevented from causing her brain to malfunction and destroy her body. This would give her immune system time to produce antibodies and fight off the virus. That's when Dr. Willoughby came up with a radical idea. It was Gina's only hope. Gina's mother, Anne, was filled with dread as she and her husband walked into Dr. Willoughby's office the next morning. She was expecting a discussion on how to prepare for Gina's death. But when they sat down in front of the pediatrician, he told them about the shocking information he'd found the night before. At first, Anne began to feel some hope, but as the doctor went through the details of his plan, she felt like she'd fallen back into a nightmare. After the doctor was done explaining his radical plan, Anne just stared at him in disbelief. The doctor wanted to put Gina into a deep, medically induced coma to take her an inch from death, to the point that her brain was completely silent. She would have no thoughts and no signals to the rest of her body. Gina would be kept alive by machines. She would need to be kept in the coma for at least 10 days, hopefully long enough to fight off what was attacking her body. Dr. Willoughby admitted they would be gambling with Gina's life. No one had ever attempted anything like this before. If it didn't work, Gina would surely die. And even if the doctor's plan worked, and Gina's body managed to fight off the disease, there was no guarantee that she would even wake up from the medically induced coma. Her brain might never be able to regain its proper functions, and she would be left in a vegetative state dependent on machines to keep her alive for the rest of her life. The thought of that sent a shiver down Anne's spine, but if they wanted to save her daughter's life, this was their only option. Anne looked to John, and he nodded. And so, with all the courage she could muster, Anne gave Dr. Willoughby the go-ahead. On October 10th, Dr. Willoughby and a surgical team gathered in the operating room. Gina was brought in, and the anesthesiologist administered drugs to induce a medical coma. The coma would help to regulate her routine brainstem functions, such as breathing and circulation. After the procedure was completed, Gina was wheeled back to the ICU. Dr. Willoughby barely left the hospital for the next few days. He would walk by Gina's room and hear the steady sounds of the machines that had taken over her body functions. He would see her parents were praying at her bedside. Dr. Willoughby prayed silently for Gina too. 10 days passed. The waiting was unbearable. Dr. Willoughby spent every moment anxiously hoping this treatment would work, and Gina's parents spent every possible second by their daughter's bedside. Finally, it was time to take her out of the coma and see if her body had been able to fight off this disease. Throughout the day, Dr. Willoughby lessened the amount of drugs that were keeping Gina asleep. If everything had worked, she'd soon be able to wake up on her own. But as the hours ticked by, the monitor tracking her brain activity was still a flat line. This was a bad sign. If the monitor didn't start showing something soon, Gina might never wake up. When Dr. Willoughby came into work early the next morning, he ran to Gina's room and checked her brain activity monitor again. The screen showed a flat line with the tiniest blips of movement on it. That meant Gina's brain was working. Dr. Willoughby breathed a sigh of relief. He couldn't believe that his plan might actually work. But Gina still had not actually woken up from the coma. When Anne and John arrived at the hospital later that morning, Dr. Willoughby led them over to Gina's bedside. He positioned Anne right over Gina's face. Then he opened Gina's eyes with a speculum, which is a tool eye doctors typically use to keep patients from blinking. Dr. Willoughby watched Gina's pupils flood with light, going big as saucers. Then they started to move. Gina was awake. Dr. Willoughby could see her eyes darting from right to left, looking all around the room, and then finally her eyes settled on her mother's face. Gina's pupils went wide with recognition, and Dr. Willoughby knew she had recognized her mom. Anne realized it too. She flashed Dr. Willoughby a grateful smile, her eyes welling with tears, and Dr. Willoughby breathed a huge sigh of relief. He took out his reflex hammer and tapped Gina's knee. But to his surprise, she didn't flinch. He tried again, but there still was no reaction. Dr. Willoughby's stomach turned. Even if Gina was still groggy, her body should have naturally had a reflex. He tried to keep a neutral expression, but he knew Anne and John could tell something was wrong. He didn't know how to tell them that Gina was awake, but physically she was paralyzed. She was literally locked inside of her body. The condition is actually called being, quote, locked in, and it's a rare disorder of the nervous system. People with locked-in syndrome are paralyzed except for the muscles that control eye movement. They're conscious and can think and reason. They can hear and see, but they can't move or speak, and they can't chew, swallow, or breathe on their own. And there was nothing Dr. Willoughby could do to help Gina. Their only hope was to wait and see if anything changed. That night, as he drove home, Dr. Willoughby prayed to God for forgiveness. He felt like he had sentenced Gina to a fate worse than death. She could spend the next 60 years as a prisoner in her own body, able to think and reason and feel, but never move. He could imagine how terrifying it would be for Gina to be going through this, after almost dying of a deadly disease. When Dr. Willoughby returned to the hospital the next day, nothing had changed. Gina's eyes darted around the room, but her body remained motionless on the hospital bed. And the day after that was exactly the same. On the third morning after Gina had woken up, Dr. Willoughby arrived at the hospital full of dread. He stopped at Gina's room first and grabbed her chart from its holder on the door. Then he walked to Gina's bedside and removed the reflex hammer out of his breast pocket. Holding his breath, he gave her knee a soft tap. Gina flinched. A short time later, Anne and John arrived in Gina's room, and Dr. Willoughby excitedly asked them to watch as he tapped Gina's knee. Again, her muscles contracted, and Gina's parents went wide-eyed. After 2 weeks of surviving on slim threads of hope, they started crying, this time out of joy. 3 months later, Gina took a deep breath and opened her eyes. She was back home in her bedroom. Even though she'd left the hospital a week ago, she still worried that she'd wake up in that awful bright white hospital room, hooked up to machines, unable to move. Coming out of the coma had felt like being underwater. She could hear the muffled voices of people she knew and see the blurry outlines of their faces. But it wasn't until Dr. Willoughby pried her eyes open that she finally broke through the surface. It had taken days for the feeling to return to her body. First, she was able to flutter her eyelids. Then she was able to twitch her fingers. Eventually, she could feel her mother holding her hand. But even as the world began to snap into focus, Gina just couldn't move very well on her own, and even though she understood what others were saying to her, she couldn't speak back. Her parents and the nurses at the hospital had to do everything for her, like bathing and feeding her, and she would spend 2 months relearning how to walk and how to say basic words. But Gina was very grateful to be alive, and while her time in the hospital was a total blur, she remembered every detail of how her deadly illness had started. One month before her symptoms had appeared, Gina and her family had gone to Sunday Mass together at St. Patrick's Catholic Church. A few minutes after Mass started, Gina looked up and spotted something small and black flying around the ceiling. It was a little bird who was trying to get outside, but it wasn't moving toward any of the open windows. Instead, it was swooping down towards the pews, a little lower each time. Most of the congregation was totally annoyed and kept swatting at it with their hats when it flew down. Then the bird grazed an usher who managed to knock it out of the air with a collection basket, and it fell to the floor and appeared stunned. Gina was an animal lover, and she felt bad for the little bird, so she got up from her seat and hurried to the back of the church, and she scooped it up. But as Gina carried this little bird in her hands, she got a closer look and realized it wasn't a bird, it was a bat. Outside the church, she opened her hands to let it go, but the bat bit her finger hard. Gina almost screamed, but she knew there were little kids watching her from inside the church, and she didn't want to scare them. So she bit her lip and whipped her hand away from the bat, sending it flying across the church lawn. Gina watched as the bat flew away and then cradled her finger. A small pinprick of blood bubbled up where the bat had broke the skin. Gina washed her hands in the bathroom and then snuck back into the church pew beside her parents, smiling as parishioners looked over and flashed grateful looks at her. Gina would tell her parents that the bird was actually a bat, but it never occurred to Gina or her family that the moment the bat's tiny fangs pierced Gina's skin, a lethal pathogen had latched onto one of the nerves in Gina's fingertip. And over the next month, that pathogen replicated and grew, crawling its way up Gina's arm and rooting in her brain. It caused her to have flu-like symptoms, blurred her vision, made her jerk and salivate uncontrollably, and eventually led her to Dr. Willoughby's care. But at that point, it was too late, because Gina now had rabies. Rabies is an acute viral infection that is transmitted to humans by a bite or by the exposure of broken skin to an infected animal's saliva. The most common wild animals that can transmit rabies to people are raccoons, skunks, bats, and foxes. Domestic mammals can also get rabies if they're unvaccinated, like cats, dogs, and cattle. Rabies can be cured with a vaccine, but it must be given within 24 to 72 hours after exposure. If it's left untreated, rabies is fatal. The virus causes significant and progressive damage to the brain and spinal cord, and by the time it's reached the brain, it's almost always too late to prevent death. Victims die painful deaths and experience delirium, abnormal behavior, hallucinations, and insomnia. But thanks to Dr. Willoughby's radical idea, Gina Geist became the first person to survive a case of full-blown rabies without a vaccine. Since then, other doctors have used the technique Dr. Willoughby pioneered to treat rabies patients when they are not eligible for the vaccine. It doesn't work every time, but sometimes the patient does pull through. It's now known as the Milwaukee Protocol. It took Gina 2 years to restore her language and motor skills, but she finished high school on time with the rest of her class, and then after graduation, she enrolled at Lakeland College to study biology because she wants to work with animals. In one of her classes, Gina studied bats, and over time, her fear of them melted away. Now, she absolutely loves them.
Some call this location the most paranormal location on the planet. Others call this whole thing just a big hoax. But what is undeniably true, and frankly what makes this case so much more interesting, is that unlike the vast majority of paranormal stories and claims, this case was put to an enormous amount of scientific scrutiny. In fact, there was a decade-long study done on this case, where PhDs and scientists converged on this one location and basically around the clock studied all these claims of the paranormal that was happening in the area. And after a decade of research, the findings are pretty mind-blowing. And the case that I'm referring to is none other than the very famous Skinwalker Ranch. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have a family that purchases a ranch out in Utah, and as soon as they move in, they start noticing some pretty bizarre things around their property. Everything from, some of their livestock going missing or being harmed. They have strange sightings in the woods of creatures and lights in the sky. They eventually report it to the news, and that news story gets picked up by a couple of other outlets, and a billionaire who is obsessed with researching the paranormal sees this story. He buys the property and installs an entire team of scientists and researchers to basically try to figure out what was happening at this ranch. And they spend 10 years studying this ranch. The outcome is, well, turns out some strange things really were happening there. Before we get started, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, mysterious content delivered in a story format, well, if that appeals to you, that's what my channel's all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, please gently ransack the like button and then turn on all notifications so you can get all of my content every time I upload every week. All right, on with the story. In the northeastern corner of Utah lies a 500-acre plot of land, it's all desert, where a ranch sits, and that is Skinwalker Ranch. It was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was actually built on a piece of land that had apparently been cursed. Prior to its construction, the Navajo tribe had a feud with the Utes Native American tribe. The Utes were selling off other Native Americans that they would capture. They would sell them into slavery to the United States. And so the Navajo, who had previously lived in the area where this ranch actually was built, they were forced off their land as the Utes came in and were rounding them up and selling them into slavery. And before the Navajo left that area, they cursed the land with what's called the Skinwalker curse. The idea was they were going to torment the Utes tribe for the hardships they had inflicted on the Navajo. The Skinwalker curse, legend has it, is this curse where these witches descend on the area and take the form or wear the skin of various predatory animals in the area, namely large wolves and foxes. They inhabit those bodies and terrorize anybody in the cursed land. At some point, this ranch is actually built on the land that had apparently been cursed. It wasn't until many years later when owners of that ranch started seeing predatory animals doing some very strange things in and around their property that they did some research on the area, learned about this curse, and then before long, the nickname had stuck. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased Skinwalker Ranch. It had actually been abandoned by the previous owners for the last few years, so when they purchased it, they got it for way below market price. So they are just so excited to be moving in. They breed cattle, and so they had 500 acres to let their cattle free roam. It was like the dream purchase for this family. And so when they finally do move in, like the day they move in, they don't really care that the grass is overgrown. It looks like things are kind of in disrepair. And in fact, when they go into the homestead, like the actual house on the property, they were so excited about everything that they kind of overlooked some of the strange things that they immediately noticed about the property. They go inside and every window has a deadbolt on it. The inside and outside of every door in the house, not just the doors leading outside, doors leading between rooms had locks, the front and back side. They noticed these big pikes that were driven into the ground at the front door and back door of the property with massive chains stringing off of them, which looked like pretty powerful guard dogs had been there. They're thinking to themselves, well, this is a huge piece of property. Perhaps the previous owners are a little bit paranoid because they're kind of isolated. And so they didn't really raise a red flag when, to be honest, had I moved into a property where every single door and window had multiple locks on it, they had these big guard dogs, I'd probably ask a couple questions. But you know what? Terry and Gwen, they're just so excited about this purchase that, again, they kind of just overlook it. So on the day that they are moving in, Terry and Gwen have some family members over to help them offload trucks and move stuff into the homestead. And it's during this process, as they're moving things out of the truck into the house, And again, you got to remember that the house is situated like right in the middle of the property, and you can see in every direction basically unobstructed because it's basically open desert, with the exception of a couple areas that are, basically forests. And as they're offloading some of the stuff into the house, Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf, or what looks like a wolf, pretty well off in the distance, kind of meandering its way over towards them. But it's far enough off that this is not enough to be totally worried about it. After all, I mean, Terry was a rancher and his family were fairly rugged. They carried weapons and they were used to, protecting their livestock from predators. So this was not a, oh my goodness, I can't believe a wolf is near us. It was more like, okay, let's make a note that there's a wolf walking towards us. And so Terry does. He tells his family, hey guys, just so you know, there's a wolf coming towards us right now. And the whole family is now standing near the truck and they're watching this wolf. And Terry recalled, as he's staring out watching this wolf, it's kind of almost walking in like a snake, like a serpentine path towards them from hundreds of yards out. It's still quite a ways out. Terry notices that there was a fence that was out where this wolf is. And the fence was pretty big, and the spaces between posts were about 6 feet. When he had a good look at the wolf next to the fence, he could tell that the wolf was at least 6 feet long. And he was thinking, are my eyes playing a trick on me? Like, that's an enormous wolf. That's the biggest wolf I've ever seen. But the wolf wasn't acting angry or aggressive. It was just kind of skulking its way towards him, very nonchalant, broad daylight. And at some point, Terry and the family, they're standing behind the truck, and Terry said that they all had this feeling that the wolf was not going to harm them. And the wolf got about 100 yards away, and Terry and his family are transfixed. And he even said he didn't understand why they weren't scared or why they weren't, running away or shooting at it or something, but they didn't. All of them are just standing there watching this wolf that's massive. And the wolf is wagging its tail and acting like a domesticated dog. The wolf comes over and goes up near Terry's father, who was there helping unload some of the gear they had. And Terry's father just kind of reflexively reaches out to start petting this. He's petting like up at his head level, this massive wolf. And the wolf just acts like a domesticated dog and kind of rubs against his hand and then starts walking away from them, just wagging its tail and not doing anything, not causing them any harm, not snarling, not growling, nothing. But just as nonchalantly as it walked over to them, it walks over to where they had a pen with a couple of cows and calves inside of this pen. And one of the calves had its head through the post that was keeping them in this cage, just kind of watching this wolf. And the wolf notices it and in an instant jumps over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. But it can't get it to squeeze through the cage. And so all of a sudden, like Terry and his family are broken out of this weird trance. And Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. It strikes the wolf and has no impact. They run over, they start hitting it with the back end of an axe. They're trying to get this thing off of the calf because their livestock, that was their livelihood. And these are rugged people, and so they're trying to fight to save their property, to save their cows. And the wolf is just totally unaffected. It's not trying to attack Terry or his son that are trying to get rid of it. The wolf is just trying to attack the cow, but it won't let go. And finally, it just kind of gives up on the calf, starts kind of retreating. Terry ends up getting his rifle, a high-powered rifle, and takes a shot at the wolf one more time. But again, it just has no impact on the wolf. And the wolf just, at some point, just as, I guess, bored, turns around and kind of trots off into the woods. After they kind of were brought out of that initial trance, that they remembered this horrible smell, that's like foul, almost chemical smell that just permeated the whole area after the wolf was there. Terry and his son, they decided to go track this wolf because now there's this massive predator that's going to make owning cattle extremely difficult, and so they would have to go deal with this predator. And so instead of retreating into the house, they grab their weapons and they track the wolf that's now jogged off into the forest. And they make it to an area in the forest where the ground is very muddy and sodden. And Terry could easily make out these footprints that just suddenly stop. And they just couldn't make sense of it. And so they went back to the house and they told their family, like, we tracked it into the woods. There's no blood trail. There's nothing. It just walked in and vanished. So this is day one of being at this ranch. And they're all on edge now. The whole family is on edge. They really don't know what to make of that wolf. The sheer size of it, the fact that it was totally unaffected by being shot multiple times. There's real concern over their own livelihood because they keep cattle and they're only going to have more that are going to be out in these pens. And if there are wolves that are 3 times the size of a normal wolf that are walking around killing cattle, that's a big problem if you own cattle. And so they're on edge, and they're all in a way trying almost not to talk about how crazy and how bizarre that encounter with the wolf was. They're just like, they're treating it like it's just a normal predator problem. Like, man, we gotta get those wolves, we gotta protect our cattle. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're like, something very strange is happening here. Gwen, she was having some other very strange things that were happening to her that she was not tying to the wolf thing. She was just noticing a couple of distinct things that were happening to her that made her think that she actually had a very real medical problem, that she had true memory issues. Because 2 things happened. One, in that first week, she had gone to the grocery store, and when she came back, she put the groceries away, and then she left to go to the other room, and when she came back, all the groceries were now back in the bags. And so for 20 minutes, she's just sitting there dumbfounded with, did I put the groceries away? Same day, she goes to take a shower, and she hangs her towel in the bathroom like anyone would, and she takes a shower, and then when she gets out, the towel's missing. And she's like, she gets another towel and she towels off, and then she finds the towel hanging up in a closet on the other side of the house. And so between the groceries and the towel, she's like, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Am I having a medical issue here that I'm literally losing my mind? And it wasn't until Terry actually had a similar experience that she started to wonder if this had to do with maybe that strangeness with the wolf, that maybe there's just something odd happening about this property. And it was Terry, in that first week, he had been digging holes for a new fence. And he had this big fence digging tool. It was about 70 pounds that he was using to dig the holes for the fence. And so he had taken a break after making a bunch of posts for this fence. He took a break, left his fence digging tool, at the last place he had dug a post, and he went in to grab a bite to eat, came back out, and his fence digger is missing. And initially he just goes into the house and he's like, hey, to his wife, to his kids, did you guys move my fence digger? Do you know what happened to it? Where is it? It's not out there. And they're like, no, we've been in the house the whole time. I have no idea. And so they couldn't find it. And a week goes by, and he's out patrolling his property looking for wolves. And in the tree, well away from where he had been digging the post before, in the tree, his fence digging tool that's 70 pounds is 70 feet in the air, strung up in this tree. So Terry comes back to the house and he tells his family about the fence digging tool being in the tree. And that's when Gwen tells Terry about her experiences with the groceries going back in the bag and a towel being moved around the house. And everybody in the family starts to really start being scared. We can't explain what's happening on this property, and we're very isolated. And what's the deal with all these locks on all the doors? They're starting to feel really concerned. Following the fence digging tool being found, Terry started to notice lights on his property. Initially, because this was the first couple of weeks they're there, he would see lights way at the far end of his property that looked like headlights, and he would think someone must have made a wrong turn that wound up on my property, and we were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll just leave. And so when he first started seeing these lights, that's what he assumed it was, just people making a wrong turn. But he started to see it so often that he wondered if people were illegally hunting on his property. And so one night he sees these lights on his property and he goes out to investigate. In fact, he's angry. He's had all these strange things happen. His family's on edge, and now he's mad and he's going to take it out on this person who's illegally hunting on his property. And he starts charging out to these lights, and he starts getting closer and closer, and he starts to realize it's not making any sound. If this was like a truck, it's not making any sound. And we're in an area where I could totally hear that if it was a vehicle, and he can't hear anything. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights start retreating from him without making a sound, and then float up into the sky and disappear. And Terry's like, what is going on here? the winter rolls around, and it's a particularly brutal winter. And one night he couldn't account for one of his cows, and so he's out looking for this one stray cow, and he searches his whole property, and there's only one area that he hasn't searched, and it's that forest where that giant wolf had disappeared after marching in there, and they tracked it in there. And so he goes in there, and as soon as he gets to the tree line, he notices there's a bunch of footprints from what looks like a cow. And he's relieved because it's probably his. He follows it into the woods, and much like the wolf that had just disappeared in that muddy, like sodden area in the forest, in the same spot, the footprints that appeared to be this cow had also just, well, disappeared. And then over the course of the remainder of the winter, that would happen 4 more times. The animals would run away and just disappear without a trace. By the end of the winter, after all these animals have just mysteriously disappeared, Terry and his family, but Terry in particular, has really gone into full paranoia mode. He, at night, would just like stalk his own property, like hiding behind bushes with his weapon, and like hope to see what was taking his cattle. And so one night, as he's doing another fruitless search around his property, he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. And at this point, he was kind of obscured by some shrubs and some plants. And so he kind of crouched down and looked out at the tree line. And he sees in the tree line this like strange shape kind of moving about inside of the trees. And he would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small. And it was making no sound, and it was hovering about 20 feet off the ground. And he's crouched down, not making a sound, watching it. And it's just kind of like moving around the tree line. And it has these lights that looks to be kind of scanning the ground. And it's just kind of moving around. It's shining these lights, these multicolored lights in the ground. And Terry moves a tiny bit to get a better angle on this thing. And he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush, just like a tiny little, barely audible sound. And this mass that's pretty far away, the lights immediately turn off, and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And Terry can feel it right away that it's heard this tiny little sound he's made, and now it's staring directly at Terry. And Terry's like terrified, and he's looking at this thing, wondering like, oh my God, like, is it gonna come take me? Like, what is this? Is this the thing that's been taking my livestock? And he's terrified, and he's staring at it, and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad for Terry and his family. Now, not only are they losing livestock inexplicably, but they're showing up. The actual cows themselves are showing up back on their property, hours or days later, just kind of in random locations on the property, and they look like they've had surgery done, like precision cuts, and pieces of them are missing. And in addition, some very strange things are happening at the house. At night, they would see these entities walking around their property, these humanoid, they described them as having no expression, just walking around their property. And sometimes they would walk right up to the glass, put their hands on the glass and look in, but there was no face. And like Terry and his family, they had blinds down, and they would use the deadbolts on every single door and window, but they could hear them rapping at the glass, and they could hear them communicating in a language they didn't understand right outside of their house. And this became so regular that it was almost impossible to sleep. Terry's kids started performing very poorly in school because they weren't sleeping. Terry's wife, Gwen, she lost her job at the bank because she wasn't sleeping, and she was like delusional. They were all just at an absolute breaking point. Terry is now feeling totally disheartened. One night he's sitting on his porch with his rifle, and he notices out on the horizon a new phenomenon. He was used to seeing the lights on his property that would be off in the distance that would disappear, and he had previously seen that kind of like fighter jet thing that was scanning the area. Like, those were 2 types of lights he would see, but there was a new light he saw as he's sitting on his porch. It was almost like this orangey orb that appeared off in the distance. Since he had his rifle with a high-powered scope on it, he just lifts up his rifle and he looks through his high-powered scope, and he zooms in all the way, and he can see that this orb, he describes it as a portal. That as he's looking at it, it has almost like an oval shape to it, and even though it was nighttime, in the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world where it's broad daylight and there's a sky. And he doesn't know what to make of it, but he can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. And it looks just like the black entities that were kind of basically walking around his property at night. In addition to these figures that are crawling, like imagine that scene from The Ring where the girl crawls out of the well. They're crawling out of this portal into his property and then scurrying away into the tree line. And he sees weird craft as well coming into his property through this portal, and then the portal shuts and disappears. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs that he and his family would say were the worst and most terrifying thing of all of the things they experienced. And considering they had tall, featureless black humanoids peering in their windows and rapping on their windows, that's saying something, okay? So a blue orb started showing up on their property. And the way they described it, Terry and his family, was whenever the orb came near you, it gave you this extreme sense of anxiety. It was almost like it was emitting this feeling that you automatically got where suddenly you were unbelievably anxious and terrified of the blue orb. And then as soon as it left, you would, not be anxious anymore. And so one night he's sitting on his porch like he had begun doing, and he sees this orb show up on his property. And his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking. And so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb. And they chase it, and you can see the orb, Terry can see the orb that starts to kind of retreat. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, I finally won something. My attack dogs are gonna scare this orb away. And they chase off into the woods, and he sees this thing, the blue orb, retreat into the woods. And then when he's thinking again that finally a little victory for us, he hears his dogs yelping. And he's too terrified to go check it out. And so he ends up going inside and locking the doors, locking the windows like they had been, and just kind of retreating. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest. And when they get out there, they get to a clearing and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire previously in these 3 little spots. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. They had just been vaporized. Terry decides that it's time to leave, and he wants to sell the ranch. And so he puts the property up for sale and goes to a local news outlet, and he tells them about what's happening on his property. And as fate would have it, a billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in standing up this scientific research team, this all-star team of PhDs, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. Basically, he was obsessed with the paranormal and wanted to investigate the paranormal. And he had actually seen that fairly obscure story. When he saw that it was up for sale, Robert Bigelow, the billionaire, saw this great opportunity to buy the piece of property and actually make it the headquarters of his own scientific research team. Not only to investigate what was happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but use it as kind of a hub to do other scientific research. So he purchases the ranch, and Terry actually, even though he did not want to spend any time at the ranch, on some level wanted to know what the research was going to show, because he was very curious, like, what is going on at this ranch that's been plaguing my family. So he offers to stay on as kind of like the ranch manager, because Robert Bigelow and his team are a bunch of scientists and business people. They don't have any experience on the ranch, and so they're happy to keep him. So Terry is still connected to the ranch, but at this point he's sold it to Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow's scientific team was called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, N-I-D-S, NIDS for short. And Bigelow had actually built the team before purchasing Skinwalker Ranch. And what he went out and did is he recruited some of the most incredible scientists and PhDs he could possibly recruit, but he didn't want people that were interested in the paranormal. He wanted people that were inherently skeptical, so that if he was ever able to kind of prove the existence of high strangeness, that he would have credibility in doing that. And so he went out and found these incredibly skeptical, incredibly smart scientists and PhDs. And so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and the first thing they do is they need to start doing testing to make sure that this whole all the stories about Skinwalker Ranch coming from Terry and his family were not just some grand illusion by the family, that they could have just made it up. And so they get in there and they start running these tests. So that first year, as they're running these tests, which are largely things like, okay, let's check the environment and see if there aren't any plants that are giving off spores that could be hallucinogenic that they're breathing in. Let's check their water supply and make sure there wasn't something happening in their water supply. Let's do psychological assessments of the family. Let's ask neighbors. Let's do all of our diligence to make sure it's not something environmental or psychological. And over that first year, while they're doing this research, there isn't much activity at the ranch, save a couple of instances where there were some strange lights. So that first year is fairly uneventful, but what's important is that the NIDS researchers come to a conclusion that this did not seem like a hallucination. This did not seem like a something coming from a plant or water supply. This seemed like the Terry and his family were really experiencing something odd. They just didn't know what it was. One day, Terry and actually Gwen, who was helping him, were tagging some of the new calves, the new cows that had been born, putting these little tags in their ears. And so Gwen was there helping. And so Terry and Gwen, they tagged this new calf, put a yellow tag in its ear, and they move on and they're tagging other animals. And so for about 40 minutes, their eyes and their attention are not focused on this one calf or that one area of the ranch. They're tagging other animals. And then their dog that was with them starts growling and reacting in the direction of where this calf had been. And so Terry and Gwen turn around and they look and they don't see anything. And they start walking over. They find the calf that they had tagged about 40 minutes ago has been basically surgically dissected. And all that's left are its legs and its head. And in addition, the ear where that tag was had been removed. And so they immediately call over the NIDS researchers. So the NIDS veterinarian comes over and looks at the scene and just can't make sense of it, because the incisions on the calf were so well done that it looked like someone with real surgical expertise had done this on an operating table. There was no sign that this was done by a predator, and there was no blood anywhere. So this prompts a massive search of the property, because in many ways, this is what the NIDS researchers are looking for, are real occurrences of something that is highly strange that they can go investigate. And so all of the researchers and everybody there begins searching the property for whoever was responsible for this dissection of the cow. And they start searching the property, and the dogs, they had all these guard dogs that were kept at each of these observation posts that they had set up around the ranch as soon as the NIDS team had moved in. They were all looking in the same direction, all four of these four observation posts, and they're all cowering in the back of their cages, all looking in the same direction. And so they start making their way towards the tree line where all these dogs are looking, and they stop short when Terry says, "I see something in the tree." So they stop their car and they're looking, and in the tree is this massive wolf, this like wolf-like humanoid that's basically perched on a tree limb. And Terry takes out his rifle and he aims at the creature up in the tree, this huge creature, and everybody sees it. All the NIDS researchers are looking at this creature and they're like, "Oh my God, what is that?" Terry starts firing at this thing and it just disappears into the woods. And so the team charges into the woods, they fan out, and they pick up a couple of tracks of this huge thing that has like this massive footprint with these huge claws. But much like the wolf that had disappeared and the cattle that had suddenly disappeared when they went into the woods, they couldn't find any traces of this thing. But they did smell this horrible stench that Terry remembered smelling. It stuck with him that first day when that large wolf had come over on the very first day they were moving in. It was that same smell, but they couldn't find this huge animal. So dumbfounded, the NIDS researchers just go back to the property and no one can make sense of it. And they have the footprint and they have their own eyewitness testimony, but like they couldn't make sense of how something that big could just get away. And so over the following month, they're like searching the property and they're looking for any more signs of this huge creature or anything. The only thing they noticed is that the guard dogs consistently stayed in their kennels and did not want to come out. They were acting like they were kind of being hunted, and they were they were cowering quite a bit, and they were scared to go out in the open, but they couldn't find anything. So it was around this time that Terry and Gwen are kind of back to doing work around the ranch, and one day they're driving off to one section of the ranch, and they pass by the corral where 4 of their prized bulls were. These are very expensive animals that are all in this enclosure. And so they drive past and they take a mental note that they're seeing these bulls in this enclosure, and they drive off to the other side of the ranch where they're doing some work, tagging animals and, building fences, whatever it is they were doing. But when they come back and they round a corner where they're first able to see that corral of bulls again, they are like, where are they? Because the bulls were not in their enclosure, and they weren't anywhere. And so they're panicked because these are very expensive animals, and they run over, and Terry sees that the gates to the corral are still locked, but there's no bulls in there. There's no sign of a struggle or anything. And it just so happens that right next to the corral was this fairly small trailer that hadn't been used in years. In fact, it was literally wired shut. It was just sitting there. And Terry, just for whatever reason, runs over and looks in one of the windows. And inside of this tiny enclosure are these 4 bulls, completely calm, all crammed into this tiny trailer. They could barely fit. They're not fighting with each other or anything. They're just calmly sitting there as if they're in some kind of a trance. And Terry yells to Gwen, like, hey, they're over here. They're right here. And it startles the bulls out of their trance. They start panicking and kicking, and they end up getting them out of this enclosure, and it takes them hours to finally round them up and get them back in the corral. But they're unharmed. But it is almost impossible to get even one bull into that small of an enclosure. It would take hours to maybe be successful at doing that. To get 4 bulls into that enclosure was pretty much impossible. And to do it when they basically were calm after they were in there is also somewhat impossible. And it was important to note that Terry saw when he looked in the window that the only entrance to that trailer was wired shut still. It had not been undone. In fact, the cobwebs at the corner where the opening basically formed with the sides of the trailer, they were still intact, like it had not opened. And it made no sense how those bulls got in there. And so the NIDS researchers come over, and they can't make sense of it either. Upon further investigation, the NIDS researchers found that the bars of the corral that held the bulls, a section of it had been highly magnetized. And so while they're doing this research, trying to figure out if magnetic fields has anything to do with the strange occurrences at the ranch, 2 of the NIDS researchers were on the outskirts of the property using their compass to look for magnetic fields, and they started smelling. They both reported smelling that horrible metallic, rotting smell that other people had reported smelling anytime they saw that large wolf creature. And when they started smelling it, their compass started to flitter and then pointed away from north towards wherever the smell was. And they remember thinking that they felt like they were being watched. And it went on for a few moments, and their compass didn't waver. It was aimed in the direction of the smell, and they're both on opposite sides, pointing in the same direction. And then at some point, the smell stops, and they stop feeling anxious, and the north arrows go back to the way they should have been. And then one of the most terrifying of all of the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. 2 NIDS researchers were up on a ridgeline overlooking the homestead. Every night it became commonplace to basically position NIDS researchers all over the property to basically be on the lookout for weird things that are happening. And these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape right near the homestead. And one of them had infrared goggles, and so he looks down at the orb, and he can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening that sounded an awful lot like what Terry had seen on his porch when he saw that humanoid creature crawling out of the portal into his property. Well, these 2 researchers are looking at this portal, and they see the same thing. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. and they're like frozen with fear. They start smelling that horrible rotting metallic smell as this big human-like creature bounds up the mountain, and they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. The following year, in 1998, the activity on the ranch declined significantly. All they had was the occasional strange lights here and there, but for the most part it was done. And in fact, even though NIDS remained on the property, by 2004, the research just wasn't amounting to anything, so they pulled the plug on the operation. They did have footage of a number of the lights that were seen, but again, no one's gonna take a picture of some random lights and say, oh, there you go, proof. You know, they demonstrated that there were, you know, magnetic fields, and they have images of these calves that would reappear after looking like they'd had surgery done to them. They had hundreds of eyewitness reports. You know, they have all this information, but none of it was really definitive proof, which was very frustrating to Robert Bigelow, to Terry and his family. And the way they described it is they felt like they were dealing with an entity or a group of entities that were just consistently one step ahead of them, that they could catch glimpses of what they were doing, but it was never enough to really understand what was happening. They never felt like they were in control. It was always clear that this entity or these entities were in control of the situation, and they never were in a good position to really record hard data or get good footage. Not to mention, this is 1998, this is the late 90s. No one just had, like, you know, an iPhone they can pull out and snap pictures. You had like real cameras. And so the best they could do was some pictures of light and some of the animals that had been mutilated. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. And to this day, many people believe that this is one of the most credible instances.
Gitaar in de hand, vrienden en familie, allemaal aan het strand. De sterren stralen, de nacht is zo helder. In deze momenten, niets is snel. Als de zomer komt, voel ik me vrij. Het leven is mooi zo dichtbij. De zon zakt weg, de lucht wordt